Now we come to chapter 3 of Great Expectations. Just to catch up on where we are. Pip has met the convict on the marshes. He has stolen some provisions, including a pork pie and some brandy and a file to take to the convict, and he is racked with guilt at having done so. He's just a small boy, but even so, he feels very guilty for having stolen the provisions and the file. Nevertheless, because he knows that if he doesn't do what the convict says, the strange, terrible young man might come along and take his heart and liver out and eat them. So to avoid that, he decides off he's going to go. It was a rainy morning and very damp. I had seen the damp lying on the outside of my little window as if some goblin had been crying there all night and using the window for a pocket handkerchief. Now I saw the damp lying on the bare hedges and spare grass, like a coarser sort of spider's web, hanging itself from twig to twig and blade to blade. On every rail and gate, wet lay clammy, and the marsh mist was so thick that the wooden finger on the post directing people to our vision, a direction which they never accepted because they never came here, was invisible to me until I was quite close up under it. Then, as I looked at it, it dripped. It seemed to my oppressed conscience like a phantom devoting me to the hulks, the prison ships where the convicts were confined. The mist was heavier when I got out on the marshes, so that instead of my running at everything seemed to run at me. This was very disagreeable to my guilty mind. The gates and dikes and banks came bursting at me through the mist as if they cried out as plainly as could be, "A boy with somebody else's pork pie! Stop him!" The cattle came upon me with like suddenness, staring out of their eyes and streaming out of their nostrils. "Hello, young thief!" One black ox with a white cravat on, who even made my awkward conscience think he was something with a clerical air, fixed me so obstinately with his eyes, and moved his blunt head around with such accusatory manner as I moved around that I blubbered out at him, "I couldn't help it, sir. It wasn't for me." Upon which he put down his head, blew a cloud of smoke out of his nose, and vanished with a kick up of his hind legs and a flourish of his tail. All this time I was getting on towards the river, but however fast I went, I couldn't warm my feet, to which the damp cold seemed riveted, as the iron was riveted to the leg of the man I was running to meet. I knew my way to the battery pretty straight, for I'd been down there on a Sunday with Joe, and Joe, sitting on an old gun, had told me that when I was prenticed to him regular bound, we should have such narks there. However, in the confusion of the mist, I found myself at last too far to the right, and consequently had to go back along the riverside on the bank of loose stones above the mud and the stakes that staked the tide out. Making my way along there with all dispatch, I crossed a ditch which I knew to be very near to the battery, and had just scrambled up the mound beyond the ditch when I saw the man sitting before me. His back was towards me, and he had his arms folded and was nodding forward, heavy with sleep. I thought he would be all the more glad that I came upon him with his breakfast in an unexpected manner, so I went forward softly and touched him on the shoulder. He instantly jumped up, and it was not the same man, but another man. And yet this man was dressed in coarse grey too, and had a great iron on his leg, and was lame and hoarse and cold, and was everything that the other man was, except that he didn't have the same face, and had a flat, broad-brimmed, low-crowned felt hat on. All this I saw in a moment, for I had only a moment to see it. He swore an oath at me, made to hit out at me. It was a round, weak blow that missed me and almost knocked himself down, for it made him stumble, and then he ran into the mist, stumbling twice as he went, and I lost him. It's the young man, I thought, feeling my heart shoot as I identified him. I dare say I should have felt a pain in my liver too, if I knew where that was. I was soon at the battery after that, and there was the right man, hugging himself and limping to and fro, as if he'd never all night left off hugging and limping, waiting for me. It was awfully cold, to be sure. I half expected to see him drop down before my face and die of deadly cold. His eyes looked so awfully hungry, too, that when I handed him the file and he laid it down on the grass, it occurred to me that he would have tried to pick it up and eat it if he hadn't seen my bundle. He didn't turn me upside down this time to get at what I had, but lifted my right side upwards while I opened the bundle and emptied my pockets. "What's in the bottle, boy?" said he. "Brandy," said I. He was already handing the mincemeat down his throat in the most curious manner, more like a man who was putting it away somewhere in a violent hurry than a man who was eating it. But he left off to take some of the liquor. He shivered all the while so violently that it was quite as much as he could do to keep the neck of the bottle between his teeth without biting it off. "I think you have the ague," said I. "I am much of that opinion, boy," said he. It's bad out here," I told him. "You've been lying out on the meshes, and they're dreadful ague-ish. Rheumatic, too." "I'll eat my breakfast afore they'll be the death of me," said he. "And I'll do that if I was going to be strung up there on that there gallows what's over there directly afterwards. I tell you, I'll beat the shivers. I'll beat the shivers." He was gobbling mincemeat, meat-bone, bread, cheese, and pork pie all at once, staring distrustfully while he did so at the mist all around him, and often even stopping his jaws to listen. Some real or fancied sound, some clink upon the river or breathing of beast upon the marsh, now gave him a start, and he said suddenly, "You're not a deceiving imp? You brought no one with you?" No, sir, no." "Nor given anyone the offence to follow you?" "No." "Well," said he, "I believe you. You'd be a fierce young hound indeed if at your time of life you could help hunt down a wretched varmint, hunted as near death and dunghill as this poor wretched varmint is." Something clicked in his throat as if he'd got works inside him like a clock and was going to strike, and he smeared his ragged sleeve over his eyes. Pitying his desolation and watching him as he gradually settled down upon the pie, I made bold to say, "I'm glad you enjoy it." Did you speak?" I said I was glad you enjoyed it." "Thank you, my boy, I do." I had often watched a large dog of ours eating his food, and I now noticed a decided similarity between the dog's way of eating and the man's. The man took strong, sharp, sudden bites, just like the dog. He swallowed, or rather snapped up, every mouthful, too soon and too fast, and he looked sideways, here and there, while he ate, as if he thought there was danger in every direction of someone's coming to take the pie away. He was altogether too unsettled in his mind over it to appreciate it comfortably, I thought, or have anybody dine with him without making a chop with his jaws at the visitor, in all of which particulars he was very much like the dog. I'm afraid you won't leave any of it for him, said I timidly, after a silence during which I hesitated, thinking about the politeness of making a remark. There's no more to be got where that came from. It was the certainty of this fact that impelled me to offer the hint. Leave any for him? Who's him? Said my friend, stopping in his crunching of pie crust. The young man you spoke of, him that was hid with you. Oh, he returned with something of a gruff laugh. Him, oh, yeah. He doesn't want no victuals. I thought he looked as if he did, said I. The man stopped eating and regarded me with the keenest scrutiny and greatest surprise. Looked? When? Just now. Where? Yonder, said I, pointing. Over there, where I found him nodding asleep and thought it was you. He held me by the collar and stared at me so that I began to think his first idea of cutting my throat had been revived. Dressed like you know, only with a hat, I explained, trembling, and I was very anxious to put this delicately, and with the same reason for wanting to borrow a file. Didn't you hear the cannon last night? Yes, there was firing, said he to himself. I wonder you shouldn't have been sure of that, I returned, for we heard it up at home, and that's further away, and we were shut in besides. Why, see now, said he, when a man's alone on these flats, with a light head and a light stomach, perishing of cold and want, he hears nothing at all night but firing of guns and voices calling. He sees the soldiers with their red coats lighted up with the torches carried afore them, closing in around him. Hears his number called, hears himself challenged, hears the rattle of muskets, hears the orders, make ready, present, covering steady men, and he's laid his hands on, and there's nothing. Why, if I see one pursuing party last night, coming up in order, damn 'em with their tramp, 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 I see 100. And as firing, well, I see them misshaped with a cannon after it was broad day. But this man, he had said all the rest as if he had forgotten my being there. Did you notice anything in him? He had a badly bruised face, said I, recalling what I had hardly knew I knew. Not here, exclaimed the man, striking his left cheek mercilessly with the flat of his hand. Yes, there. Where is he? He crammed what little food was left into the breast of his grey jacket. Show me the way he went. I'll pull him down like a bloodhound. Curse this iron on my sore leg. Here, give us hold of the file, boy. I indicated in which direction the mist had shrouded the other man, and he looked up at it for an instant. But he was down on the rank, wet grass, filing at his iron like a madman, and not minding me or minding his own leg, which had an old chafe upon it and was bloody, but which he handled as roughly as if he had no more feeling in it than the file. I was very much afraid of him again, now that he'd worked himself into this fierce hurry, and I was likewise very much afraid of keeping away from home any longer. I told him I must go, but he took no notice, so I thought the best thing I could do was to slip off. The last I saw of him, his head was bent over his knee, and he was working hard at his fetter, muttering impatient imprecations at it and his leg. The last I heard of him, I stopped in the mist to listen. He was there, working on his leg, and the file was still going. Chapter 4. 2 small explanations. In 18th century churches, very often the pews and the pulpit were arranged in a horsebox manner. The congregation in the horseboxes and a 3-decker pulpit. In the lower level, there was a Bible so that the lessons could be read. In the next level, slightly higher up, the clerk, so called, would read out the psalms to be said or sung, and in the upper level, the minister would preach. Mr. Wopsle, whom we'll meet in a moment, was the clerk of the church where Joe and Pip worshipped. I don't know whether you've ever seen a memorial stone, a memorial tomb in a medieval church of a crusader with his legs crossed one over the other. Dickens makes reference to that kind of picture, just so you don't get confused. And remember, this was Christmas Day. I fully expected to find a constable in the kitchen wanting to take me up. But not only was there no constable there, but no discovery had yet been made of the robbery. Mrs. Joe was prodigiously busy in getting the house ready for the festivities of the day, and Joe had been put upon the kitchen doorstep to keep him out of the dustpan, an article into which his destiny always led him sooner or later when my sister was vigorously reaping the floors of her establishment. "Where the deuce have you been?" was Mrs. Joe's Christmas salutation when I and my conscience showed ourselves. I said I'd been down to hear the carols. "Ah, well," observed Mrs. Joe, "you might have done worse. Not a doubt of that. Perhaps if I weren't a blacksmith's wife, and what's the same thing, a slave with her apron never off, I should have been with you to hear the carols," said Mrs. Joe. "I'm rather partial to carols myself, and that's the best of the reasons for my never hearing any." Joe, who had ventured into the kitchen after me as the dustpan had retired before us, drew the back of his hand across his nose with a conciliatory air. When Mrs. Joe darted a look at him, and when her eyes were withdrawn, secretly he crossed his 2 forefingers and exhibited them to me, as a token that Mrs. Joe was in a cross temper. This was so much her normal state that Joe and I would often for weeks together be, as to our fingers, monumental crusaders with their legs crossed. We were to have a superb dinner, consisting of a leg of pickled pork and greens, and a pair of roasted stuffed fowls. A handsome mince pie had been made yesterday morning, which accounted for the mincemeat not being missed, and the pudding, which was already on the boil. These extensive arrangements occasioned us to be cut off unceremoniously in respect of breakfast. "For I ain't," said Mrs. Joe, "I ain't a-going to have you cramming and bursting and washing up the way I've got what to do before me, I promise you." So we had our slices served out as if we were 2,000 troops on a forced march instead of a man and a boy at home, and we took gulps of milk and water with apologetic countenances from a jug on the dresser. In the meantime, Mrs. Joe put clean white curtains up and tacked a new flowered flounce across the wide chimney to replace the old one, and uncovered the little state parlour across the passage, which was never uncovered at any time, but passed the rest of the year in a cool haze of silver paper, which even extended to the 4 little white crockery poodles on the mantel shelf, each with a black nose and a basket of flowers in his mouth, and each the counterpart of the other. Mrs. Joe was a very clean housekeeper, but she had an exquisite art of making her cleanliness more uncomfortable and unacceptable than the dirt itself. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and some people do the same by their religion. My sister, having so much to do, was going to church vicariously. That is to say, Joe and I were going. In his working clothes, Joe was a well-knit, characteristic-looking blacksmith. In his holiday clothes, he was more like a scarecrow in good circumstances than anything else. Nothing that he wore fitted him or seemed to belong to him, and everything that he wore grazed him. On the present festive occasion, he emerged from his room when the blithe bells were going, the picture of misery in a full suit of Sunday penitentials. As to me, I think my sister must have had some general idea that I was a young offender whom a policeman had taken up on my birthday and delivered me to her to be dealt with according to the outraged majesty of the law. I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born, in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. Even when I was taken to have a new set of clothes, the tailor had orders to make them like a kind of reformatory, and on no account to let me have the free use of my limbs. Joe and I were going to church, therefore, and we must have made a moving spectacle for compassionate minds. Yet what I suffered outside was nothing to what I underwent within. The terrors that had assailed me whenever Mrs. Joe had gone near the pantry or out of the room were only to be equalled by the remorse with which my mind dwelt on what my hands had done. Under the weight of my wicked secret, I pondered whether the church would be powerful enough to shield me from the vengeance of the terrible young man if I divulged that to the establishment. I conceived the idea that the time when the banns were read and when the clergyman said, "You're now to declare it," would be the time for me to rise and propose a private conference in the vestry. I am very far from being sure that I might not have astonished our small congregation by resorting to this extreme measure, but for its being Christmas Day and not Sunday. Mr. Wopsle, the clerk at church, was to dine with us, and Mr. Hubble, the wheelwright, and Mrs. Hubble, and Uncle Pumblechook, Joe's uncle, but Mrs. Joe had appropriated him. He was a well-to-do corn chandler in the nearest town and drove his own chaise cart. The dinner hour was 1:30. When Joe and I got home, we found the table laid and Mrs. Joe dressed, and the dinner dressing and the front door unlocked. It was never unlocked at any other time. But the company was to come in by it, and everything had to be splendid. Still, there wasn't a word of the robbery. The time came, without bringing it any relief to my feelings, that the company came. Mr. Wopsle united a Roman nose and a large, shining, bald forehead with a deep voice, of which he was uncommonly proud. Indeed, it was understood among his acquaintances that if you could only give him his head, he would read the clergyman into fits. He himself confessed that if the church was thrown open, meaning to competition, he would not despair of making his mark in it. The church not being thrown open to competition, he was, as I have said, just our clerk. But he punished the amens tremendously. And when he gave out the psalm, always giving the whole verse, he looked round at the congregation first, as much as to say, "You have heard my friend overhead," that is the minister. "Oblige me with your opinion of this style." I opened the door to the company, making believe that it was a habit of ours to open the front door, and I opened it first to Mr. Wopsle, next to Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, and last of all to Uncle Pumblechook. You must note I was not allowed to call him uncle under the very serious and most severest of penalties. "Mrs. Joe," said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish, dull, staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so he looked as if he'd just about been choked and had at the moment come to. "Mrs. Joe, I have brought you, as the compliments of the season, I have brought you, mum, a bottle of sherry wine, and I have brought you, mum, a bottle of port wine." Every Christmas Day he presented himself as a profound novelty, with exactly the same words, and carrying the two bottles like dumbbells. And every Christmas Day Mrs. Joe replied, as she did now, "Oh, Uncle Pumblechook, that is kind." Every Christmas Day he retorted, as he now retorted, "It is no more than your merits, and now are you all bobbish? And how's sixpence halfpenny?" meaning me. We dined on these occasions in the kitchen, and adjourned for the nuts and oranges and apples to the parlour, which was a change very like Joe's change from his working clothes to his Sunday dress. My sister was uncommonly lively on this present occasion, and indeed was generally more gracious in the society of Mrs. Hubble than in any other company. I remember Mrs. Hubble to be a little curly, sharp-edged person in sky blue, who had held a conventionally juvenile position because she had married Mr. Hubble, I don't know at what remote period, when she was much younger than he. I remember Mr. Hubble as a tough, high-shouldered, stooping old man with a sawdusty fragrance, with his legs extraordinarily wide apart, so that in my short days I always saw miles of open country between them whenever I met him coming up the lane. Among this good company I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't robbed the pantry, in a false position. Not because I was squeezed in at an acute angle of the tablecloth, with the table in my chest and the Pumblechookian elbow in my eye, nor because I was not allowed to speak. I didn't want to speak. Nor because I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks of the fowls, and with those obscure corners of the pork, of which the pig, when living, had had the least reason to be vain. No, I shouldn't have minded that, if they would only leave me alone. But they wouldn't leave me alone. They seemed to think the opportunity lost if they failed to point the conversation at me every now and then and stick the point into me. I might have been an unfortunate little bull in a Spanish arena. I got so smartingly touched up by these moral goads. It began the moment we sat down to dinner. Mr. Wopsle said grace with theatrical declamation, as it now appears to me something like a religious cross of the Holy Ghost and the ghost in Hamlet and Richard III, and ended with a very proper aspiration that we might all feel truly grateful, upon which my sister fixed me with her eye and said in a low, reproachful voice, "Did you hear that? Be grateful."
"Especially," said Mr. Pumblechook, "be grateful, boy, to them which brought you up by hand."
Mrs. Hubble shook her head and, contemplating me with a mournful resentment that I should come to no good, said, "Why is it that the young are never grateful?" This moral mystery seemed too much for the company until Mr. Hubble tersely resolved it by saying, "Naturally vicious." Everybody agreed, true, and turned and looked at me in a particular unpleasant and unpersonal manner. Joe's station and influence were something feebler, if possible, when there was company than when there was none. But he always aided and comforted me when he could, in some way of his own. And he always did so at dinner time by giving me gravy, if there was any. There being plenty of gravy today, Joe spooned it into my plate at this point, about half a pint. A little later on in the dinner, Mr. Wopsle reviewed the sermon with some severity and intimated, in the usual hypothetical case of the church being thrown open to competition, what kind of sermon he would have given. After favouring them with some heads of that discourse, he remarked that he considered the subject of the day's homily ill chosen, which was the less excusable, he added, when there were so many subjects going about.
"True again," said Uncle Pumblechook. "You have hit it, sir. Plenty of subjects going about, for them as know how to put salt upon their tails. That's what's wanted. A man needn't go so far to find a subject if he's ready with his salt box."
Mr. Pumblechook added, after a short interval of reflection,
"Look at pork alone. There's a subject. If you want a subject, look at pork."
"True, sir. Many a moral for the young," returned Mr. Wopsle. And I knew he was going to lug me in before he said it. "Many a moral may be deduced from that text." "You listen to this," said my sister to me in a severe parenthesis. Joe gave me some more gravy. "Swine," pursued Mr. Wopsle in his deepest, darkest voice, pointing his fork at my blushes as if he were mentioning my Christian names. "Swine were the company of the prodigal. The gluttony of the swine is before us as an example to the young." I thought this was pretty well in him who had been praising up the pork for being so plump and juicy. "What is detestable in a pig is more detestable in a boy."
"Or a girl,"
interrupted Mr. Hubble.
"Oh, yes, of course, yes, of course. A girl,"
assented Mr. Wopsle rather irritably.
"But there is no girl present." "Besides," said Mr. Pumblechook, turning sharp upon me, "think of what you have to be grateful. If you had been born a squeaker—"
"He was, if ever their child was," said my sister most emphatically. Joe gave me some more gravy.
"Well, But I mean a four-footed squeaker, said Mr. Pumblechook. If you had been born a four-footed squeaker, where would you have been now?
Unless in that form, said Mr. Wopsle, nodding at the dish before us.
I didn't mean in that form, sir,
returned Mr. Pumblechook, who had an objection to being interrupted.
I mean enjoying himself with his elders and betters, and improving himself with their conversation, and rolling in the lap of luxury. Would he have been doing that? No, he wouldn't. And what would have been your destination?
Turning to me again.
You would have been disposed of for so many shillings according to the market price of the article, and Dunstable the butcher would have come upon you, and as you lay in your straw, he would have whipped you under his left arm, and with his right he would have tucked up his frock to get a penknife, and from his waistcoat pocket, and he would have shed your blood and had your life. And there would have been no bringing up by hand. Not a bit of it.
Joe offered me some more gravy, which I was afraid to take. He was a world of trouble to you, ma'am, said Mrs. Hubble commiseratingly. Trouble? Echoed my sister. Trouble? And then entered upon a fearful catalogue of all the illnesses I had been guilty of, and all the acts of sleeplessness I had committed, and all the high places I had tumbled from, and all the low places I had tumbled into, and all the injuries I had done myself, and all the times she had wished me in my grave, and I had stupidly refused to go there. I think the Romans must have aggravated one another very much with their noses. Perhaps they came to be the restless people they were in consequence. Anyhow, Mr. Wopsle's Roman nose so aggravated me during the recital of my misdemeanours that I should have liked to pull it until it howled. But all I had endured up to this time was nothing in comparison with the awful feelings that took possession of me when the pause was broken, which ensued upon my sister's recital, and in which the pause everyone had looked at me, as I felt painfully conscious, with indignation and abhorrence.
Yes,
said Mr. Pumblechook, leading the company gently back to the theme from which they had strayed. Pork!
Regarded as billed, as rich too, ain't it?
Have a little brandy, uncle, said my sister.
Oh, heavens! It had come at last. He would find it was weak. He would say it was weak, and I was lost. I held tight to the leg of the table under the cloth with both hands and awaited my fate. My sister went for the stone bottle, came back with the stone bottle, and poured his brandy out, no one else taking any. The wretched man trifled with his glass, took it up, looked at it through the light, put it down, prolonged my misery. All this time Mrs. Joe and Joe were briskly clearing the table for the pie and the pudding. I couldn't keep my eyes off him, always holding tight by the leg of the table with my hands and feet. I saw the miserable creature finger his glass playfully, take it up, smile, throw his head back, and drink the brandy off. Instantly afterwards, the company was seized with unspeakable consternation, owing to his springing to his feet, turning round several times in an appalling spasmodic whooping cough dance, and rushing out at the door. He then became visible through the window, violently plunging and expectorating, making the most hideous faces, and apparently out of his mind. I held on tight while Mrs. Joe and Joe ran to him. I didn't doubt what I had done. I had no doubt that I had murdered him, somehow. In my dreadful situation, it was a relief when he was brought back and surveying the company all round,
as if they disagreed with him, sank down into his chair with one significant gasp.
Tar!
I had filled up the bottle from the tar water jug. I knew it would be worse by and by. I moved the table like a medium of the present day by the vigour of my unseen hold upon it.
Tar?
Cried my sister in amazement.
However would tar get into it?
But Uncle Pumblechook, who was omnipotent in that kitchen, wouldn't hear a word. He wouldn't hear a word of the subject. He imperiously waved it away with his hand and asked for hot gin and ginger. My sister, who had begun to be alarmingly meditative, had to employ herself actively in getting the gin, the hot water, the sugar, the lemon peel, mixing them. For the time being, at least, I was saved. I still held on to the leg of the table, but clutched it now with a fervour of gratitude. By degrees, I became calm enough to release my grasp and partake of the pudding. Mr. Pumblechook partook of the pudding. All partook of the pudding. The course terminated, and Mr. Pumblechook began to beam under the genial influence of the gin and water. I began to think I should get over the day, when my sister said to Joe,
Clean plates? Cold.
I clutched the leg of the table again, immediately, and pressed it to my bosom as if it had been the companion of my youth and friend of my soul. I saw what was coming, and I felt it this time I was really gone.
You must taste,
said my sister, addressing the guests with her best grace.
You must taste to finish with such a delightful and delicious present of Uncle Pumblechook's.
Must they? Let them not hope to taste it.
You must know,
said my sister, rising.
It's a pie, a savoury pork pie.
The company murmured their compliments. Uncle Pumblechook, sensible of having deserved well of his fellow creatures, said quite vivaciously, all things considered,
Well, Mrs. Joe, we'll do our best endeavours. Let us have a cut of the same pie.
My sister went out to get it. I heard her steps proceed to the pantry. I saw Mr. Pumblechook balance his knife. I saw a reawakening appetite in the Roman nostrils of Mr. Wopsle. I heard Mr. Hubble remark,
A bit of savoury pork pie would lay atop of anything you could mention and do no harm.
And I heard Joe say,
You shall have some, Pip.
I had never been so absolutely certain whether I uttered a shrill yell of terror merely in spirit or in the bodily hearing of the company. I felt that I could bear it no more and that I must run away. I released the leg of the table and ran for my life. But I ran no further than the house door, for there I ran head foremost into a party of soldiers with their muskets, one of whom held out a pair of handcuffs to me, saying,
Here you are. Look sharp. Come on.